Hi, and welcome to the second episode of Conversations with the Pioneer with me, Kushan Mitra. Today we have a very close friend of mine, Vivan Sharan. Vivan is a policy wonk, an author on economic issues, and has been just come out with a report on the Indian television broadcasting sector called Indian TV Broadcasting at a Crossroads. If any of you have been watching the news of late, on TV news of late, you'll suddenly be wondering why does content on TV news, or for that matter, even on regular general entertainment channels, so poor? And Vivan has some answers to that. So I'll just bring up the title of an old Bruce Springsteen song to start. It's called 57 Channels and Nothing On. Right now, we have over 500 channels and nothing on. Vivan, you have some answers to that. Why is there nothing on television?
So actually, Kushan, thank you for this opportunity. There are over 900 channels in India, of which 700 or so are free to air, and the rest are paid channels. I doubt that very many of the consumers consuming Indian TV, which is about 200 million households, realize that there's a mix of free and paid channels. So in some ways, I think the regulatory failure in all of this begins with the lack of consumer awareness of what their rights are, what they are paying for, etc. For instance, there are about 60 million cable TV homes in the country. Very few of them, according to surveys we are privy to, are actually aware that they're entitled to itemized bills, that they're entitled to knowing what they're paying for, and so on. And this is where I think the genesis of the problem lies. If we look at the history of regulated sectors in India, and very briefly, over the last 30 years, the premise of independent regulation and creating independent regulatory authorities has been to incentivize economic activities in key sectors that have grown. These are sectors ranging from energy to mobility to telecom and broadcasting, that are also the markets where most economic activity tends to happen. And broadcasting is no different. In the early 2000s, we had a proliferation of private broadcasters, and therefore the government thought it best at the time to designate TRAI, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, as the regulator for TV as well. This was ostensibly an interim measure because the TRAI is staffed with people from the Indian Telecommunications Service, and as the name suggests, they have a telecom lens. But when you apply a telecom lens, which is essentially a lens where you are looking at pipes or infrastructure, telecom infrastructure, rather than content, since not all bits and bytes are equal, content on television is not homogeneous or is not supposed to be homogeneous. When you apply a telecom lens to TV regulation, you tend to homogenize the content that is on TV as well. And to unpack that a little bit, the moment you apply price regulation to a sector that depends on content, you are creating an exceptional framework in that most democracies across the world, and certainly all mature TV markets, treat the carriage of content or regulate the carriage of content very differently from content itself, and they do so under separate umbrellas. Content is mostly regulated in most jurisdictions across the world through the lens of intellectual property, copyright in particular, whereas carriage of that content is regulated by regulators that are similar to TRAI in that they regulate the infrastructural element of distribution. And so when you create a regime where there is price regulation happening in a content and carriage paradigm, that price regulation actually distorts the incentives for content creators to create heterogeneous content that is differentiated, that caters to niche tastes and so on. The moment you price regulate, there is a lack of incentive to actually create such content because you are heavily dependent automatically on ad revenues. In India, the skew between ad and subscription revenues on TV is 70 to 30 roughly, which is the inverse of what is true in most mature TV markets across the world. That is, most mature TV markets depend on subscription revenues primarily, and then ads act as sort of a nice bump up for profits, but they don't rely on ads to actually program. And there's a very good reason for this, obviously, that, as you know, and as you've seen during COVID times, ad markets are historically very volatile. Whereas when you produce content, you need to be aware of your revenue streams because you're paying people upstream. You're not going to argue with Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan on the rates that they charge you upstream for creating some piece of content. But when you're uncertain about the downstream and your ability to market and monetize that content, then you'll automatically have a certain risk aversion in that content creation, and you want to cater to the bottom of the pyramid. And that's what we see, or the base of the pyramid, which is very broad and homogenized. That is why you see a preponderance on content that seeks to achieve maximum eyeball reach, rather than seeking to create a real choice for consumers to consume what they want to. And again, it's common across most goods and services that when consumers actually pay for those goods and services based on whatever the market prices are, they are more likely to be able to exercise that choice in an informed way. Whereas in India, because of the proliferation of ad-driven content, again, tracing back to the regulatory intervention on the pricing side, consumers are not really exercising that choice. And even when they're paying for content, they're not even aware that they're paying for content that is a bundle of paid content and free content. So there's a lot of issues here, but I think the original sin lies in actually treating this sector as a telecom sector where all bits and bytes that are flowing through pipes are equal. And as I said, content is not equal. And if you homogenize the bits and bytes that are flowing through broadcast pipes, then you're automatically creating a disincentive for heterogeneity of content available on TV.
So basically, when you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. So you're getting the quality you're paying for. And
part of the rationale of that is obviously access and affordability driven, which is of course in the consumer interest. But today, like we discussed, if you have over 900 channels, this is a hyper competitive market with hundreds of broadcasters. This is very unlike telecom, which has about 3.5 operators, with the half being perhaps the state operator, which is now a very consolidated market. And the TRAI, the same regulator, applies the principle of forbearance on price regulation in telecom, which is that Vodafone, Idea, Airtel, etc., are able to price their service without fetters from the regulator based on the access of consumers, the number of consumers in the market, where they, premium services versus other services, etc. Whereas in the broadcasting realm, that is not possible because you have this distortionary impact of intervention where someone else is setting the prices and then you're following suit. You're kind of working backwards from what your reality is ordained to be by the regulator.
I mean, Vivan, I cut the cord a few years ago now. I mean, I just stream off my Wi-Fi fiber at home. But somebody who's not cut the cord, he or she would be very confused about a la carte and bundles and this pricing confusion over there. Why can't, if I want a premium channel, which could be a, infotainment channel or whatever it is, or we don't have too many premium channels. We don't have a HBO Max over here. We don't have a premium movie channel over here where I would pay, say 100 rupees a month for that because there are price caps. And you think broadcasting is also therefore losing subscribers like me and you and other high-end subscribers to operators like Netflix and Hotstar, as well as Amazon Prime, by all this regulation?
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 elements to this, Kushan. Firstly, India is lucky in that it has been able to create a base where a lot of traditional players in media and entertainment have invested in the over-the-top services that you've just mentioned. So India, unlike some of the very heavily protected markets like France and others in the European Union, which have always historically taken a very protectionist approach towards local content, etc. Those markets are actually not, they're completely saturated by large foreign OTT services. But in India, we have a number of homegrown services. We have over 50 OTT video operators, of which a large share are actually from traditional media and entertainment businesses. So one aspect of this is that the transition has happened almost seamlessly, and it has come to a point where our local operators that have transitioned into OTT services are able to compete and play on the same field as a Netflix or an Amazon Prime. So at this juncture, where the market is again in attrition mode because of the lack of ad revenues and so on and so forth, and the regulatory interventions that make life very confusing for subscribers that have to exercise choice every year actively. We are kind of constraining that transition from reaching its natural end, where we actually consolidate this market, and Indian players and the local ecosystem is able to transition from TV to OTT without losing jobs and without erosion of value. So that is one end of it. The other is that we have to think about resilience in regulation, embedded within regulation. Otherwise, most regulators are given a two-pronged legislative mandate to ensure orderly market growth and to ensure consumer welfare. In the Indian markets, because of the litigious nature of TV markets, and again, that stems from the kind of regulatory interventions that we've had, you don't really have orderly market growth. You have a time now when several channels are shutting down, ranging from the Delhi Aaj Tak to even niche channels that are contemplating exiting the market, which cater to science and technology content. The Discoveries and National Geographics of the world are not having the best time in this market because they have to be bundled in a way with free channels that the TRAI prescribes, rather than what they would like to be bundled as, because their prices are controlled as soon as they are in a bundle. So that is one element of it, that the orderly market growth is therefore not ensured. And as far as consumer welfare is concerned, the one way to measure it is consumer surplus. And in a market over the last 2 years where you've had 26 million subscribers drop off, clearly there's no case to be made that a consumer surplus paradigm was achieved by the regulator in intervening in markets repeatedly. And therefore, we are actually shortening the time span that broadcasting has to actually consolidate, to unfetter the OTT ecosystem from a local transition. And that is, I think, problematic. I mean, it can be nobody's case, Kushan, that you or I represent the average Indian consumer.
No.
The average Indian consumer is still pretty hooked to TV. I would give it another 5 to 7 years at the very least, because culturally we are a market where we watch TV in households and so on. And private viewing is less of a prominent phenomenon than Western markets, which have completely transitioned, and there's been a lot of cord cutting. Here, the cord cutting is happening because of regulatory interventions, and that can be proven if you just see the last 1.5 years of outcomes based on the last regulatory intervention. Because if it was the case, let's make this case clearer. Over the last 4 or 5 years, you've had a democratization of internet access in India, unlike anywhere else in the world. So you have over 600 million broadband consumers in India. A lot of those came online over the last 4 years, partly thanks to Jio and the competitiveness imperative that it created in the Indian telecom markets, and we have therefore the lowest data tariffs in the world. Despite that democratization of internet access and therefore access to video services, over the last 4 years, you didn't have this attrition in subscription. You had this attrition in subscription over the last 1.5 years, and this actually predates COVID. So COVID is not necessarily a factor in all of this. By April, you already had 26 million people drop off the TV networks as a result of the previous regulatory framework that TRAI had brought in, which was an extension of its micromanagement ethos. And now the TRAI wants to again amend that framework and further micromanage the ability of broadcasters to price their content, the ability of broadcasters to offer the content in a way that they would deem fit. Again, going back to the Discovery Nat Geo example, today Discovery or Nat Geo face an existential crisis in India because they can't even bundle themselves in a way that they would want to, because their prices are constrained by the overall price of the bundle. They can't price above the price of a bundle. Now, who is the regulator to decide this in a hyper-competitive market? And that's really where the question lies. Unless there is a market failure that is clear, discernible, and proven, and we are talking about evidence-based regulation so much these days, unless we can prove that market failure, what is the rationale to keep acting and intervening in the sector? That is very unclear to many of us who are observers of this market.
So if Discovery or Nat Geo want to price their channels at 100 rupees, they should be allowed to do that, because it, as you're saying, it's an extremely competitive market. And if I don't want to
subscribe, and who would want to exclude themselves from subscription markets, right? I mean, why would you price yourself above what you think the demand curve meets the supply curve? Are you saying that somehow these market actors are irrational, or that they're cartelizing in a market where there are hundreds of broadcasters, which is hyper competitive? I think both rationale in economics 101 will prove that they're both faulty rationale.
Do you see any change happening, particularly given the post-COVID environment where, as we discussed earlier, advertising revenues have collapsed?
Yeah, they have collapsed quite substantively, Kushan. I mean, there are obviously counterfactuals to everything, and a few of the flagship properties, like around cricket, etc., may not have collapsed completely. But if you look at on average, you're looking at spot rates that have fallen by over 50% for TV, which is very problematic. And by the way, the TV ad market is over 60,000 crores. So this is a huge amount of value. And it's not just direct value that comes by way of revenues to broadcasters. You're talking about an ad market which fuels consumption in the country. Why is TV ad spot rate still manifold times greater than what you would get for an OTT service? The reason is that TV still has that reach, and therefore it proves that the lifespan of TV, were there to be no distortions in this market, would be far beyond what is the case for mature markets. Therefore, we need to enable a transition which is orderly, which takes advantage of this paradigm in an environment where we are struggling to figure out what are the bright spots in the economy, what are the resilient sectors in the economy, which are the sectors that have an incentive to transition and have begun that transition to become more resilient, to become more digitized, to become more productive and efficient. TV stands out as a remarkable example of success despite the regulator. And this is the thing. I mean, we have such a large market. We have all the ingredients for this transition, save a regulator that looks at the transition imperative as something that is key to its own existence and the national interest.
Vivaan, one final question I want to get to. We have a telecom regulator running the television industry in India, as you said. Many of us look at the British regulator, Ofcom, as a great example of what a regulator should be, or even to an extent the Federal Communications Council in the US. What should a regulator ideally be like, in your opinion?
Well, if you're regulating content, then you better have content specialists doing that regulation so that they understand that content creation is not a mechanical activity. There's not a black box where you have certain inputs and then some outputs come out. You need creativity in that entire process. That creativity stems from the notion of exclusivity, from the notion of being able to balance access to that content with the monetization of that content, which is a principle that is hard-coded into copyright and intellectual property laws. Copyright, the very nature of the economic principle at the heart of copyright is that there has to be a balance between the distribution imperative and the exclusivity imperative, so that you are able to monetize at where the supply curve meets the demand curve. As soon as you start intervening in that process, you create structural barriers to those curves meeting in places where it is actually optimal for market participants and consumers alike. And therefore, just coming back to the question of ad spot rates, uh, the nature of the market is that it's still a large market. We need to make sure that it sustains and it creates brands, it drives consumption as it has been doing all these years, and that there are no distortions in that process.
No, I mean, it's a remarkable thing. Indian television um, created a multi-billion-dollar sports league in the last decade. I mean, the IPL has been the IPL success story. I don't think can be told without Indian television. Definitely,
And just to complete this thought process, what would you or I as Indian TV consumers really want to see in the future? I mean, what would compel me not to cut the cord? It would be very, very differentiated in niche programming. I would want to watch science and technology shows. I would want to watch shows on the incredible Indian innovation ecosystem that is nascent and growing. I would want to watch shows that point me towards the future of my country. And unfortunately, today, at a time when the youth need a sense of purpose more than ever, they are watching and enthralled by content that seeks to cater to a very, very base mass impulse of sensationalism that you see on TV news, or of very vanilla stories that are continuing from the 90s and 80s, linear narratives that will not exist in the next 10 years as content itself becomes bundled with so many new technologies where you're going to be able to exercise options in what not only what you want to watch, but the characters that are that you're watching, what their storylines are, etc., etc. So those options are not going to come online anytime soon for television viewers unless the sector is profitable, and it is a sector where big business is not necessarily seen as antithetical to consumer interests if the competition imperative is ensured. And competition, as we've discussed, is we are already in a hyper competitive realm in this market. So we need to kind of dial it back to see where the market failure really has arisen.
No. I mean, you in the US, you've spoken of the last decade of being the golden age of television creativity. It's so many great shows coming out. Of course, Game of Thrones, Mad Men, etc., etc. I see a lot of creativity on the OTT platforms, even the Indian OTT platforms, whether it's Hotstar or ZEE5 or the others. I mean, there's a lot of more creativity and sort of pushing the boundaries over there than television channels in India have shown. Your comments on news channels are well taken. I'm sure people would pay for a good news channel, but the imperative to be eyeball imperative, as you called it, is what's driving them right now. Thank you, Vivaan. Thank you so much for your time. If you guys have any comments, questions, please do send them over here. Leave your comments over here. And we shall see you in the next Pioneer Conversations very soon. Thanks, Sitan.